by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio. I am your host, Diamond, from Oppenheimer Ranch Project and Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube. And my lovely co-host is back, and partner, Leah Shaper. Welcome back.
Hello. It's good to be back.
Well, you don't have any preparation or didn't do any research because you were on vacation.
No, I'm fully unprepared today.
I picked an interesting topic that will be easy for you to comment on. We've discussed it in short in the past, and the topic of discussion today will be the Missoula floods.
Cool.
These are also known as the Spokane floods, the Brett's floods, and the Bretz's flood. So
a lot of names.
Yeah. These are cataclysmic glacial lake outburst floods that occurred in the Pacific Northwest, and they created some amazing topography, including the Scablands. Now, there has been discussion about this now for over a century. So they first, like some of the first people looking into it, started noticing some weird topography. It looked, because they called it the Scablands because no one could farm there because there was no soil. The soil was completely missing from these huge valleys. And no one put two and two together until like 1910 when someone's like, wait a minute, this is a big dry river basin.
Yeah.
And then they could visualize this massive river stripping everything away but no longer being there.
Right.
So that is how the whole scientific inquiry began, when someone noticed that they were standing in a giant empty river basin.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just strange too, to be in a valley and there's like basically no sediment at all. It's like, where did it go?
Where did it go? It's kind of like the Grand Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to read you a quote here. This is from Norman MacLean in a book he wrote in the early 1920s. A river runs through it. It might be not the 1920s. But what he says is it was the biggest flood in the world for which there is geologic evidence. It was so vast, a geologic event, that the mind of man could only conceive of it, but could not prove it until photographs could be taken from earthly satellites. So based on that statement alone, these features were so gigantic that even the people that were proposing what had happened here were laughed at. And so this is a very true statement and amazing. He said, there's no way we're going to be able to prove this until we can take pictures from space. That's how big of an event this was.
Yeah.
So let's share the screen and make it interesting. Of course. So here's what's interesting. This is the wiki on the Missoula floods. It says the floods have been researched since the 1920s. During the last deglaciation that followed the end of the last glacial maximum. So for those of you out there that don't know when that is, it is argued that the last glacial maximum is somewhere around 18,500 years ago. This is when the thickest ice in the last 100,000 years existed on Earth, and it's literally the peak of the ice age of the last 100,000 years. Geologists estimate that the cycle of flooding here, so they're saying that this isn't one flood, there's multiple floods happening here, okay? They're saying that the cycle of flooding and reformation of the lake lasted an average of 55 years. So there's a glacial lake, Missoula, which your face is right in front of here. Can you see this map?
Yeah, I can.
So Glacial Lake Missoula is over here on the right side. It says, Matt, at one point, like, let's say 15,000 years ago, it was the biggest freshwater lake in North America. And the only reason it was filling this entire valley up here in Montana, in western Montana, was because of this little pinch point right here. There was an ice dam. Their Purcell Trench was filled with a lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet that had extended past the access where this lake could then drain out into the Spokane River and then down out into the Pacific.
Okay.
So during the last glacial maximum at 18,500 years ago, an arm of the Laurentide ice sheet cut off this basin. And then after the peak of the ice age, something called the Bowling-Alarod warming happened out of the blue. And this, the hypothesis is that this arm of the Laurentide ice sheet didn't melt back far enough to open up the access. So a huge lake started forming. And that when the lake got to a certain level, it either went over top of the ice arm, thereby breaching it, causing massive melting, erosion, destruction, and outflow, whereby then it reformed again after the lake had drained low enough to stop flowing. The ice arm reformed again, which allowed the lake to rise. So that's kind of the cycle that they hypothesize. Can you visualize that?
Yeah.
Excellent. So that is the background story. Now, it makes sense because I'll just pull up two graphs here. They're both the same graph showing the Pleistocene here and somewhere around 15,000, little after 15,000 years ago, maybe back here is the, according to this graph, this would be saying at 16,000 years ago was the glacial maximum.
Right.
You see that on that graph?
Yep.
We pull up a different graph. It shows 17,300. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So either way, this was the peak of the ice, and then something started to happen. All of a sudden, around 17,000 years ago, the temperature rapidly started rising to a peak 14,000 years ago.
I still want to know what caused that Bowling-Alarod warming. It's such a mystery.
Well, it comes to a rapid end 12,900 years ago at the Younger Dryas event.
Yeah.
So that gives us a period of warming from about 17,000 years ago to the Younger Dryas event. You agree with that?
Yes.
This is exactly what they say is the period of outwash from this lake, 15 to 13,000 years ago. So it's definitely connected to the Bowling-Alarod warming, in my opinion, and not the impact on the ice sheet that caused the final melting of it.
Correct. I completely
that
agree
would have
with
been
that.
the Younger Dryas event and then the Carolina Bay Formation.
Right.
So there's catastrophes happening that we've been going over now for thousands of years leading up to the big catastrophe, the Younger Dryas event. Earth was in a blender, literally.
Yeah.
And in the second half of the podcast, I found some historical accounts of the natives in the Pacific Northwest that describe this flood. And what's interesting is around the same time they published the paper on the historical accounts, they found human poop in a cave in Oregon that dated 15,000 years ago.
Wow.
And so that puts humans right here at the beginning of the flooding.
It was
And
witnessed.
maybe they were literally crapping themselves in a cave.
Well, that's quite possible with a flood this size, but
Oh, we're going to get into it. This is no ordinary flood.
yeah.
It's no ordinary flood. So, but according to the accounts here, this flood is not also a one and done. For 2,000 years, every 55 years, there's one of these floods.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because even if you look at it, it even extends sort of to a longer period. The warming is like over a 4,500 year period. And so it makes sense that there's going to be some warming and cooling in that process.
Yeah,
we
well,
go
in this
all the way
graph,
from like 17,300 all the way to the Younger Dryas.
This is a Northern Hemisphere graph, and it shows the warming doesn't start until 15,000, which would correspond
I was getting 17 from the other graph, but
yeah. So in this graph, it corresponds exactly to the outwash, and then they end here at the Younger Dryas event. So in this Bowling-Alarod span, it is exactly the span of the floods.
Yeah, yeah.
And they've dated these floods using, this is a great area to date things because Mount St. Helens and other volcanoes are constantly erupting. So there's ash layers that are markers where they can tell what time it is.
Yeah.
It's not very hard stratigraphy to date because it's pretty recent. And we've got volcanoes that are pretty easily dated, erupting all over. And we can find those ash layers. We can do geochemical analysis and determine exactly which eruption it was, and then know the timing.
Mm-hmm.
So this is pretty good stratigraphy here. Now, the floods have been researched since the 1920s. We said that. And then there's two accounts here. We said that the one idea is that about every 55 years, the floods occurred over a 2,000-year period between 15 and 13. Those numbers are according to the USGS Jim O'Connor. But the Museo Nacional de Ciencias Naturales scientist Geraldo Benito did his own analysis, and he found evidence of 25 separate floods, with the largest discharging 10 cubic kilometers per hour, which is 2.7 cubic meters per second, or 13 times the outflow of the Amazon.
Wow.
That's a pretty big outflow.
Wow.
Now, alternative estimates for peak flow rate of the largest flood include 17 cubic kilometers per hour, which is twice that, which would be equivalent to 10 times the volume of all the rivers on Earth.
Yeah. That's really hard to wrap your brain around. Like, okay, the other week when our river, the Rio Blanco here, was flooding, I was watching it and thinking about, it's still hard to even just conceptualize that. Even though I know that the snow is still melting in the mountains, it's really hard to wrap your head around how much water that produces, even when you're looking at it. Like, it seems almost impossible. And that's a drop compared to this. I mean, this is completely insane. It's just such
just
a
from that
huge
little
quantity
bit
of water.
Just from the little bit of snow, it flows that high for weeks.
Right. Like, for such an extended period of time. It's not an instantaneous flood. I mean, it is in the geological time span, but on the day-to-day level, it's not instantaneous, but it's just such a huge volume of water. It takes quite some time to flow out.
Well, this would be literally an instantaneous flood, but at such a grand scale, because it's literally draining all the Great Lakes in a few days down a tiny cataract canyon. It's going to take days for that water to get through there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what it did, these floods, literally the largest floods with geologic evidence on Earth, reach a critical maximum. You can only get a flood so big flowing across the land.
Mm-hmm.
And these floods, the largest of which we just talked about, would have been flowing across the surface of the Pacific Northwest at a depth of over 800 feet.
My God.
That's deeper than the depth of our valley.
Yes.
Filled with water. And this water is moving at 80 miles per hour, faster than anything flows on Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. And that there were any witnesses to this at all is remarkable, to say the least.
Well, guess where they were?
Up high.
Yeah, they all ran up a mountain. So when it comes downstream, let's say you're where these natives were, they were 100 miles downstream. So the river's going to slowly be rising there, and you're going to be like, oh my God, then it's going to fill the whole valley. Then you're going to run up on the hill, and then it's going to keep coming. So most people will have time to keep running higher and higher.
Yeah.
And it's even more interesting about the topography. Because
I was going to say too, if you don't have that topography available to you, you're toast.
Yeah, if you're in the flatland, that's like 3 miles to get to a hill, it's over, Johnny. Or
Yeah.
you hop into a boat and maybe make it.
If you have one, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're on a river. They probably had boats back then. Yeah, so what's more interesting, we're going to go over the topography in a minute. As this giant outwash is occurring and able to create the Scablands by literally erasing all of the dirt and plants, everything, all the way scouring to the bedrock, it started to create features Similar to Niagara Falls at a scale of 100 times larger. And these are unfathomable until geologists started to understand the flood and look at these structures decades ago. They were like, this is a cataract. This is formed from a waterfall. And these structures that we'll look at are 8 miles wide. A
Wow.
waterfall 8 miles across, 800 foot deep.
Oh,
The sound was so deafening, your eardrums would have ruptured.
yeah.
The power of the water going over a cataract like that would have caused earthquakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a pretty significant event.
To say the least.
Now, here's a picture I brought up here. What can you notice about the topography behind, I don't know if this is a church or a Big Ben or whatever, but what do you see on that hill?
I mean, it looks like there's like massive sheet flow behind it.
Just more obviously, if we were, let's say, at a reservoir that had been drained because of a period of drought, every year it would form a line like this.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
These are the lake levels of the glacial lake that was being evacuated. This is sitting inside glacial Lake Missoula.
Mm-hmm.
And they noticed these, and this is like how the geology began. In fact, excuse me, in an article published in 1910, the U.S. Geological Survey geologist Joseph Thomas Pardee attributed the strikingly horizontal parallel lines you're looking at here on the western side of Mounts Jumbo and Sentinel to terraces cut in the slope by windborne waves on a gradually decreasing glacial lake.
Mm-hmm.
So as it was draining, you could almost see like there were like, it would drain like 80 feet and sit there for a while. There's a bigger scour from the wind, and then drain another 80 feet. And then it kind of sat there for a day and then another 80. But in between, there were shorter pulses of drainage. You see that?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
So either this lake is slowly draining completely through time, and each one of these is a pulse, because now we're in the lake, or this is the sequence of one continuous outwash that took a long period of time and was like a cyclic outflow, and it was just one flood.
Well, and maybe that cyclic outflow is the result of the sort of the freeze thaw that we were talking about, that cycle.
Yeah, that is one answer there.
Mm-hmm.
The features on the landscape led him to believe that there had once been a lake covering the Clark Fork drainage from Flathead and Missoula valleys to the Montana-Idaho border. So he realized this is a gigantic lake.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's covering most of western Montana.
Mm-hmm.
This article back in 1910 became the first substantial work done on glacial Lake Missoula. But unfortunately, it sat in relative obscurity for several hundred years before geologists really began studying this and other glacial lakes.
Well, and this is a perfect example of why this is much more obvious once we have the ability to look at this from above, from satellite, let's say.
Yeah, because you're going to see the scale and extent.
Right. I mean, the lake is so large that it's going to be hard to pick out from the ground.
Yeah, because it's filled with cities and roads.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to find, essentially you have to find this texture in the landscape to find the edges of the lake, and that's going to be quite difficult.
Yeah, and so it was the Scablands and following that back to the pinch point where the lake drained that led them to prove that this was the point source of the water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are other pinch points past the Scablands we'll talk about, that as this giant flood is coming, trying to get to the Pacific, it hit another mountain. And the only thing in the mountain was a little notch, and all that water couldn't get through there. So the water started backing up into other places, forming more lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And then through that notch, it couldn't get all the way to the Pacific again, and it hit another pinch point, and it backfilled the entire Willamette Valley.
Mm.
And this is where they found the Willamette meteor, which is the most gigantic, pristine, intact meteor that's supposed to be from around the Younger Dryas period.
Interesting.
It could have just been a meteor that was up on the ice sheet or up near the glacial lake that got transported almost all the way to the ocean.
Sure.
Just an ice raft leg backed into one of these bays that was filling. And then when it drained, it just sat on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is pretty interesting stuff. So about 10 years after Party's 1910 study and several hundred miles to the west, a surly geomorphologist named Harlan Bretz started looking at what the farmers in eastern and central Washington were calling the Scablands. Now, I already just gave away the whole geologic story, so and they did put the pieces together. These are scab-like rock exposures that spread across rolling green farmland. It's rolling green farmland now because, well, in the last 12,000 years, there's some thin soils there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what is a scabland? So the channeled scablands are called one of the 7 wonders of Washington State. Have you ever heard of that?
No, actually.
No, neither have I. But here you're looking at a great idea of the general landscape.
Mm-hmm.
They do have the most fascinating geologic story on how they were created because they were created by the largest flood that's conceivable.
Mm-hmm.
Like you couldn't even conceive having a bigger flood.
Mm-hmm.
Unless somehow you could flood the ocean across the continents, but that is a different story.
Right.
So the channeled scablands extend from an area around Spokane west to the Columbia River near Vantage and southwest to the Snake River near Pasco. This is almost all of western Washington. See this?
Mm-hmm.
And the arrows are depicting the deepest channels. So if you're standing where a green or a blue arrow is, you would be in a deep channel, similar to standing in one of our valleys.
Mm-hmm. And those channels are clearly quite wide as well.
Wide and large. And they spread in every direction from one single point. So this is a massive wall of water that's coming through here and able to go in any direction because it's so deep, it has to go in every direction.
Mm-hmm.
All right, where was I? Yeah, so the channeled scablands are the area with almost no vegetation that you're looking at here. It's most of western Washington. They're known as the channeled scablands because they are crisscrossed by long channels that are cut directly into the bedrock called coulees. So a coulee literally looks like a U-shaped valley like ours, but it's scoured straight into the bedrock and there is no dirt at the bottom. Like our whole valley is filled with soil.
Yeah.
Probably hundreds of feet.
Yeah.
This is all missing in the 150 distinct coulees.
Yeah.
And so here's the whole picture in a graphic. You've got Glacial Lake Missoula here in Montana, the ice dam, the arm of the Laurentide ice sheet, the access point to all of western Washington through here, and then it simply fills this low-lying area running in a direction downhill, kind of this way, till it hits this wall, can't go over these mountains, and it finds and scours the Columbia River Gorge, which is very deep, half a mile deep, and then hits this pinch point here on its way to the Pacific and backs up into the Willamette Valley here and forms a gigantic backwater lake. Pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Now, the 2 largest coulees, the coulees are up in here, remember, in the channeled scablands? Here's like a picture of one of these. And you can see it's all rock. It's like slick rock.
Yeah.
Only what could be soil is this little detritus, but that's all in the last 10,000 years.
Yeah.
That little bit of weathering.
Yeah.
So I said there are 150 distinct coulees or these scoured channels. Some of them are hundreds of feet deep. The 2 largest are Moses Coulee, which is 40 miles long, and the Grand Coulee, which is 60 miles long. Look at the scale of the waterfall here.
Yeah.
In one of the coulees.
Yeah.
And you can just scale it up that there would have been a flood that would have covered this entire area at one point, and then one that covered this entire area at one point, and one that covered the whole thing at one point.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Oh, yeah. And it's just getting interesting as we go to the break. Be right back.
Listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslopes.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. There was blood on the wire. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West. There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons. Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. #1 is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. #2 is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. #3, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. #4 is Advanced Ancient Global Civilizations. Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back to the show, ladies and gentlemen. We were just talking about the 150 coulees that were scoured during the largest flood fathomable on Earth. Do you have any thoughts after you marinated on it?
Not really. I was kind of looking into a little bit the Willamette meteor right now, just now. It's quite large.
It's huge.
It's very, very strange looking. It's 15.5 tons. It's the 6th largest in the world that we know of. It's iron. It's pitted, supposedly from sitting in a moist forest for a long time, and probably also because of being carried by water to its present location.
Yeah, and God knows what happened to it on the glacier or during this flood.
Right, right. I mean, it reminds
All
me
right.
too of, we've talked many times about in our valley, right? That this river valley probably was one big wide river at one time, and then if you go up into the side, into the sides of the valley, and you have these big washes with boulders of enormous size that really only could have been moved by water. It's the same concept.
Yeah, and right on the other side, the Valle Seco is a dry lake, a glacial lake that drained into our valley during the last ice age.
Yeah.
So it's a
like
similar
a
thing that happened here in a tiny scale is happening in the largest possible scale up here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, the funny thing is that when J. Harlan Bretz in 1923 proposed the theory of the flood because of how big it had to be, other geologists thought he was totally nuts. I mean, they attacked him, they distanced themselves from him, and it took 50 years. It wasn't until early 1970s that this hypothesis was accepted. 50 years. And obviously, you know what that was because NASA's satellite imagery came out and they all looked at it and they were like, oh my God.
Right. It's the same freaking story with every scientific discovery, right? There's always somebody at the cutting edge who comes up with this idea, then he gets vilified for it because it's too wacky and it doesn't fit with the current ideas, and then that person turns out to be correct. It doesn't mean that every wacky theory is correct, but it's the same. It happens the same way.
Yeah. And so now the consensus is clear that this is a massive floodscape.
Mm-hmm.
Over 500 cubic miles of water swept across this landscape in a wall of water hundreds of feet deep and washed away everything in its path in just a matter of days.
Including the soil.
Yes. The water flow of this mega flood was as great as the combined flow of all the rivers in the whole world times 10. And geologists have calculated that the Missoula floods created their own earthquakes as they thundered across the landscape. The most dramatic evidence of the Missoula floods is Dry Falls. And I don't have a picture of Dry Falls here.
What is Dry Falls?
It's right here. So see this back wall here?
Yeah.
This would have been a waterfall cascading into these giant potholes here.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to put Niagara Falls on top of here, it would be a little square like this. You see what I'm outlining?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which does help give some perspective if you've ever been to Niagara Falls and just felt the power of that.
This Dry Falls here is a cliff 3.5 miles wide and 400 feet high. And at the peak flow, based on the size and shape of this waterfall, the floodwaters here were possibly 800 feet deep at the top of the falls. So the volume of water, icebergs, house-sized boulders crashing over the falls would have been unimaginable, including the Willamette meteorite is in that. But that's trapped in a giant block of ice, just moving 80 miles an hour downstream.
Don't want to get in the way of that, that's for sure.
When the topsoil was all washed away, the floodwaters had scoured thousands of square miles of basalt bedrock and created the coulees we see today. Once Glacial Lake Missoula drained and the flood stopped, the ice dam gradually formed again and the glacial lake was recreated. Eventually, the second ice dam collapsed and another mega flood was unleashed. And geologists believe this happened up to 40 times over that 2,000-year period. And it ended at the Younger Dryas event. Now, according to this hypothesis, each mega flood compounded the erosion of the previous one and culminated in the bizarre landforms now called the channeled Scablands. But this concept is not necessary. You can create this all in one flood.
Mm-hmm.
If the flood water was 800 feet above the top of this dry falls, you wouldn't need more than one of them to remove everything and erode this landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there are these glacial outburst floods, the largest that we see in modern times, that happen in Iceland. They're called Jökulhlaups. And a recent one happened from Grímsvötn. They happen every couple of years, every 4 years. The volcano burps under the glacier. It starts forming this huge pocket of water, a subsurface lake. The lake grows and grows until the pressure squeezes a sliver out of the bottom of the glacier, and then it expands due to melting. And then the entire pocket, maybe cubic miles of water, erupt out of this hole in a matter of seconds.
Mm.
Now, the interesting thing about Jökulhlaups compared to this is they're much smaller in scale. But if you look at the deposits from them, it forms the same exact structure as these microvarves or these rhythmites.
Mm-hmm.
They claim that each of these rhythmites represents one flood from glacial Lake Missoula. But in the last Jökulhlaup from Grímsvötn, one outwash, when they looked at the sediment and they cut it in half, it had dozens of rhythmites from the single flood.
Interesting.
So this can all be one flood here. That's changing, because these deposits are the ones that are in the back bay of, let's say, Willamette Lake.
Mm-hmm.
They're not in the river channel. The channel is scouring everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's those lakes that fill up in the back that create these sediments. And what you can have is a period of pulses of clastic and less clastic. So there would be coarse to fine material happening as cycles within the same flood, because that's what's happening in the Jökulhlaups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this doesn't have to be, each of these stripes doesn't have to be a single event. It could all happen in one event. Especially if the event takes days.
Yeah.
And so picture at the head of the dam that burst. The water is flowing out like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And each of the lulls, there's muddy water that comes out. And in the blasts, it's sandy water. So as that's traveling downstream, the back bays get a plume of sand that dumps out, then a plume of mud, then a plume of sand. This is all the same flood, then a plume of sand and mud, then sand. It's all the same thing flowing by.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is the final deposit from the largest flood that ever occurred on Earth.
God. It is truly difficult to wrap your brain around that.
Yeah. So I am not a fan of the multiple flood hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
Because the natives talk about one flood.
Yeah.
So you've got to take into account all of the data if you're going to come up with a hypothesis of what happened here. And now that we know that these glacial outburst floods in Iceland can form multiple rhythmites, I think there was 28 rhythmites in the one Jökulhlaups. And here, the most rhythmites they can find is up to 45. So it's between 20 and 40 that they're claiming is between 20 and 40 floods. But if you can get just as many rhythmites in one flood, therefore it can be just one flood.
Yeah. Well, and it again, it makes me think about, what's happened recently in our own valley with our river overflowing. And there is a pulse to it, right? The river levels go up and down and up and down.
Breathes. Wow,
it breathes. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And you can watch that. I mean, you can just go look at the river at different times of day and you see that there's a pulse to it. And it does have to do with cooling and warming up high in the mountains and all of that, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and there's some other fantastic features out here where you can see where the sheet flow came across. These are dunes that are formed from water flow, and they're even curved. Do you see the curvature on that one?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is a tractor trailer. So these dunes are 100 feet long and hundreds of feet across.
Mm-hmm.
In order to get a dune of that size, you need 500 to 1,000 feet of water above the dune.
Yeah.
That's exceptional.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is amazing evidence here. And then look at like some ripples here in the front.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on here in this valley. And if you
Mhm.
were standing where that tractor trailer was, there was no way you could have survived.
Yeah.
Humans can't even be under 500 feet of water.
Yeah.
You get bent.
Well, and the other analogy here too is these dunes. I mean, they remind me a bit of, ripples on a beach that you get just from the water flow. Again, it's that pulse, that breathing of the water
In
moving.
and out.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a simulation on the floods.
Mhm.
It's not that good, but I will leave links to everyone below so they can take a look at the simulation for themselves, because it changes the orientation of the map. From north is always not north. It's very bizarre.
Oh, that's frustrating.
Why they do that. But just so you know, the links will be below. And let's dive into the comparative native oral history from what we just learned about everything we learned about the Missoula floods. The Missoula floods occurred approximately 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. We know this. And they occurred when waters held back a finger of the Purcell ice lobe, gave way, allowing water which covered present-day Missoula, Montana, to inundate Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And this is where I got the data about the poop. That's why I wanted to read this.
Mm.
The survivability in the canoes. Strength of ropes. Here it is. Anthropological dating of the ancient native peoples does point to human occupation of these lands, with findings of human feces in caves found in Oregon dating approximately 15,000 years ago.
Mm.
Although occupation by current tribes may not have occurred until later, an equation created out of the histories of native people from the affected region gives validity to survival by providing tensile rope strength on cedar ropes used, as well as drag forces on canoe under force by the moving water.
I didn't quite get that.
The strength of the ropes, drag forces on the canoes, and comparison of the histories in regards to peaks and places for survivorship fit together in a time frame best described in geologic time for the people who emerged in the region affected by cataclysmic floods. He's saying that the people that emerged there had technologies that only would have been needed in a cataclysmic flood.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That is really interesting.
And then that brings us to the Kalapuyan eyewitness to the mega flood in the Willamette Valley. So this wouldn't have really been the actual center of the channeled Scablands. Those people are all washed away.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get to the map. Where is it? So this is where the main destruction is happening as it's washing straight across the entire state here.
Mm-hmm.
Pinch point, large backup lake, couple pinch points. It's trying to go out here.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about natives that were down here as the water started to back up in their little creek.
Mm-hmm.
Their little creek went from 8 inches deep to 10 feet to 50 to 80 to probably 500 feet deep in a few hours. So these are the people that made it down here and what they said. It's kind of broken up here, but Kalapuyans living in the valley would have seen and experienced this flood and reacted to it to save themselves. Well, do you think so?
Yeah. I don't think they're going to just sit there and let it take them.
Yeah, but this statement may seem odd because archaeologists have yet to find 15,000-year dates for any Kalapuyan sites in the valley. But that must have been quelched because they just found 15,000-year-old poop in a cave.
Well, and also, I mean, any settlement is probably going to be washed away. Not to say that the people didn't necessarily make it, but surely they were living closer to the river.
Everyone back then lived on a river. Every pueblo here is 10 feet above the river.
Exactly.
And when a 500-foot flood comes by, yeah. Let me get some of these accounts here. There are 2 stories from Kalapuyan oral accounts that address a flood. Both stories are origin stories for the tribe. Their technology and the animals people of the land and the animal people of the land. I don't know what the heck that means. The floods likely brought with them instant changes to the culture of the peoples affected. Do you think?
That's what I was about to say.
There's no more soil.
It's like the most obvious possible conclusion you could reach.
Then the environment of the land may have changed significantly. At one level, destroying
May have.
yeah. At one level, destroying whole animal and plant species, and at another level, influencing other animals and plant species to become prominent.
Duh.
All right, now here's the story. It's called Panther, Coyote, Whale's Daughter, the Flood Obtaining the Fire. And this comes from an account of Jacobs Melville in Kalapuya Text, Volume 2, 1945. You can see the University of Washington digital collection for the full texts. Now, this story suggests that great changes came to the Willamette Valley environment in a story surrounded around a great flood event. In the story, we witness the birth of a panther, a deer, and the death of a coyote. The birth and death of these central figures just before a massive flood suggests changes came to the land. So they're in the story, they're talking about the Bowling Alarod warming before the flood. These massive changes came to the land, then the flood. I mean, and now we have that on a ice core.
Yeah.
Okay, so that gave me chills. We also see that a whale and a mudfish are powerful figures.
Yes.
That's interesting because it connects the ocean with muddy backwater lakes.
Yeah.
Which were about to form during the flood. We see that the whale and the mudfish are not threatened by the waters. And a chicken hawk as well is unscathed. Well, that's probably because they can fly.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the story, there is a birth of fire. The end of the story is the Younger Dryas event.
Wow. Wow.
Which would be comets coming in a fiery death knell to end the ice age.
What an absolutely crazy time to be alive. And over a period of several thousand years.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look at those graphs of temperature, right, like this, and this period in between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, it's as if something came and just like took Earth and just shook it. You know, it's like, how did this happen? It's all triggered by the Bowling Alarod warming. It's where it all starts.
And if we had a temperature fluctuation just like this cooling event 8,000 years ago, most of humanity would die.
Right. And then so the extremity of temperature shift.
How did we make it through here?
Right. And of course, it comes with huge floods and all kinds of other Earth changes.
Yeah. So we can put that story together rather quickly in a few sentences. It explains the whole event here. And it goes on to say, this may seem confusing, but native oral history does not always proceed in a linear manner. And so we cannot assume that the birth and death of any figures in the story were literally before the flood. Instead, it's necessary to look at the story as an attempt by early Kalapuyan to assign meaning and unscientific casualty to the changes brought to their lands by the flood.
I think it's actually, in a way, rather quite literal. I mean, it is metaphorical, right? In some sense, but it does seem...
But you and I as scientists have the data to say, no, this is literal.
Yeah. And it is quite linear. It does seem to be a literal, linear description of the events that occurred.
Yeah. Okay. So this section of the story is the flood story. And he cut the 2 braids of the woman's hair and he gave it to a small chicken hawk. Now Coyote's child, which he removed from her womb, he threw into the stream. Now the man leaped ashore, then all the people went away. Now the water came up. The flood rose. And some of the people, the large birds, carried them up on their backs. They took them to a big mountain. All those people went to that big mountain there. Now the water was coming up higher. All the country was filled with water. The skunk took an oak puffball and he made a hole in it, in the oak puffball. He got inside that, and to be sure that the oak puffball floated on top of the water.
Wow.
Now all of the people were running along. They climbed up the big mountain. Now it was on that one very loftiest mountain. Then all those people got up there, to there. And the copperhead snake was carrying the fire along as he swam.
Wow.
So that could be the comet coming in that hits the ice sheet 12-9.
Yeah.
The copperhead snake on fire.
Yeah. I also really like the description of cutting the woman's braid. It's like that's the moment where the water escapes that ice dam, right? And everything starts flowing.
That's how they described it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, the snake was kind of, now the water pretty near got to the top of the mountain. It would have if it's 500-600 feet deep here.
Yeah.
Then those people said to the panther, "What have you taken? This water does not want to go back." And so he said, "I took nothing. I took only my child, and I took that woman's hair." Oh, the people said, "Throw away that hair of hers. Nay, it is that which is pursuing." So the panther told him, "Throw the hair into the water." Surely enough, the small chicken hawk threw the hair into the water, and to be sure, the water went down, and then it went back.
It's like fully allowing the water to flow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it shows that the flood happened, it didn't drain, and then it drained.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And they never saw anything like this. So to them, it seemed like the whole world filled with water.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you would have no knowledge of other parts of the continent that were not flooded like that.
Yeah.
So that would be your whole world. I love I wonder what the reference to the birds that fly people up to the mountain. I wonder what that is. Right? Because there's a distinction. There are people who walk up the mountain, but then prior to that, there's the people that are able to fly up there on the backs of birds.
Maybe someone finally was warning people. So they're
Yeah.
explaining how we got people, we evacuated them.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were certainly people that were unaware.
Yeah.
There would
Yeah.
be the people aware that are watching it, and then
Right.
the people that are unaware that you have to
Right.
go save.
Yeah. And maybe also there's some smaller group of people that have intuition about this event occurring as well.
Yeah. So let's real quick talk about what they say about this. The most interesting part is about the woman's hair. And at the end,
Mhm.
the excerpt was, "Throw away that hair of hers. Maybe it is that which is pursuing."
It's like her hair is like the ice dam.
Yeah, it's the boogeyman. They don't know what it is, but it's her braid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then sorry, go ahead.
According to this, it says it suggests that the people were confused as to why the floods came to the valley.
Mm-hmm.
They were seeking a reason, a casualty, and they found it in the woman's hair. You see, hair for Native people has all of their power. It carries out the history as it grows longer each day, and thus experiences all of the same things as we do. Therefore, cutting one's long hair suggests that we get rid of all of our old history in an instant.
Wow.
Which is what the flood did.
Wow, that's cool. Well, and then the other part of this that fascinates me is the removal of the baby from the woman, like early in this
It was
story.
a coyote baby, wasn't it?
I don't remember.
Yeah. It was a coyote.
Very interesting. It's
Yeah,
literally like, it's almost as if it's like the ice gave birth to something that washed everything away and started a whole new cycle. Which in and of itself is very interesting, right? Because the whole event and the story itself is like, it's a catastrophe that causes endings, which brings in new beginnings and a completely new landscape. So it's like a birthing of sorts.
And they're even explaining the transition from Clovis to Folsom, which is exactly what happened here.
Yeah.
If this flood event ends at the Younger Dryas event and the Copperhead that was on fire ended the Ice Age and caused the Carolina Bays, it also made mammoths extinct, which was their main food supply. And when they came to, there's no more mammoth, and they have to start eating deer. And the deer is in the story.
And they have to change their culture and how they make weapons as well.
Fascinating show. Thanks for coming.
Next time.